and welcome to another episode of Faith Stories, Saints, Sinners, and Spicy Takes. I am your host, Reverend Kathleen McMurray, joined today by the Reverend Jay Clark.
Not the wonderful Reverend Jay Clark? All right, well, Kathleen and I are both pastors at Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we're just happy to be here with you during this time.
Faith Stories is a podcast where we take a look at stories and people from history, good, bad, and ugly, and draw out lessons for life and faith. So we hope to learn some new things about history, have some fun and some laughs, and discover deeper meaning for our faith.
Today, it seems like every time we turn on the news, we're reminded that the 20-year anniversary of September 11th is coming, especially during this time in the last week or so, as we've seen the horrific images coming out of Afghanistan. We're switching gears a little bit and looking at the history of Afghanistan as a region and what we can learn and think about as we look at those images and wrestle with this situation.
We know that for some of you guys, some of our listeners, this topic may be really personal. It might bring some pain along with it. Some of you may have known people or yourself served in Afghanistan, or you have pretty terrible memories of September 11th, 2001. And so we will do our best as we talk through this history of this region of our world and our country's involvement there to do so with respect for those who have served and those who have been affected by the traumas of conflict there.
And Kathleen, you've done quite a bit of research about the history of Afghanistan, the region. So why don't you share with our listeners just a little bit about that?
Sure thing. So I have done some research. I want to clarify and start by saying I'm by no means an expert, but the research that I've done, my info today, comes from Pantsuit Politics, a podcast that I listen to on the regular, from Axios, Politico, and the BBC, as well as some other sources. Afghanistan is located in Western Asia. It is surrounded, it has Iran to the west and Pakistan to the east. The terrain is really important as we're thinking about the situation there. And there are mountains and deserts, really extreme temperatures. It gets really, really hot in the summer and really, really cold in the winter. Afghanistan is about the size of Texas, but it has about 11 million more people than the state of Texas. And there are lots of different ethnic groups and religions in the region, despite what we may kind of think in lumping together people in kind of one understanding of culture. Since the settlement there in 7000 BC, this region, this country, has never really had a period of stability. So Alexander the Great conquered it in 330 BC. Genghis Khan invaded in the 13th century. The British have fought 3 wars there. There's been a ton of civil wars in which foreign nations have been involved, including the Soviet Union and Iran and the U.S. And because of all of this conflict and all of these wars, the countryside and the living situation for people has suffered terribly because of all of this violence. So there are unexploded mines everywhere throughout the landscape that often take the lives of children. And so that's something that people are constantly thinking about, and war is constantly in front of them, and has been for a long time. Even when there are periods of relative stability, that war is constant because of the effect on the landscape. Hunting and drought have hurt the wildlife there. Tigers are extinct, bears and wolves are close, and snow leopards are endangered species. So when we're thinking about that region, it is important for us to remember that it is just such a vastly different outlook on life than what we're used to. And so one of the things that we hear a lot about when we're talking specifically about Afghanistan in relationship to where they are now is the Taliban. Now, the Taliban, it's separate from Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Often we think of those 3 kind of interchangeably. We just lump them together as like they're terrorist organizations, but they're different, and it's important to understand that difference when we're talking about and thinking about what's going on in the region and the history that got us to this point. So Taliban literally means student. It is a religious and political group that emerged in northern Pakistan. They emerged in the civil war that followed the withdrawal of Soviet troops in 1989 and kind of began to really take shape in the early 90s, predominantly in the southwest and the Pakistan border areas of Afghanistan. So it is believed that this predominantly Pashtun movement first appeared in religious seminaries, mostly paid for with money from Saudi Arabia. The seminaries were preaching a very hardline form of Sunni Islam. And when the Taliban, this group, kind of lobbied for and took power in Afghanistan there in the early 90s, they vowed to fight corruption that was going on, because there was a lot of corruption in the government that had kind of been fueled by all of these wars, all of these civil wars, all of these international players in that area. There was a lot of corruption that came out of that. And so the Taliban, as they took power, vowed to fight that corruption and to improve security, especially against those outside forces that threatened Afghanistan and put them in that constant state of war for millennia. So this promise for peace and security was welcomed by many of the Afghan people because they were tired of the millennia of occupation and war and fighting and corruption. That was this narrative and this reality of complete instability. And so when the Taliban came to power and was saying, we're going to stop corruption, we are going to encourage peace and stability, there was this promise for that was generally welcomed by the people. And the Taliban were effective at rooting out corruption and maintaining security. They rooted out corruption and lawlessness. They created roads that could be used safely for commerce that would help with economic growth. But along with the peace and security came, because of their history, because that group was born from those extreme religious seminaries out of Saudi Arabia, along with that security came an extreme hardline form of Islamic law. So by 1996, then, you've got the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan that is a totalitarian state run by the Taliban, where girls could not be educated, where women could not work or travel outside their homes unless accompanied by a male relative, where you had, according to the Sharia law, public executions, where thieves would get their hands chopped off, where women were stoned for adultery, where television, music, and cinema was banned. And so that was the state that you were in by 1996. By 1998, the Taliban had essentially taken over and had in their control 90% of Afghanistan. And in their control and in their identity as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, they kept close ties with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. But most countries around the world did not recognize the Taliban as a legitimate governing authority because of the way that they had gotten there. And despite a close relationship with Pakistan, the Taliban threatened Pakistan at one point, and there were atrocities and conflicts that evolved there, including the shooting of Malala, which you may remember led to a global outcry. I heard an interview with Amy McGrath, who ran for the Senate in Kentucky, but who also served in Afghanistan, and she's done work and talks about the region since then. And she said that for kind of the everyday folks in Afghanistan, the everyday folks there, that members of the Taliban are like Yankees fans. Everybody, here in the U.S., everybody knows somebody that's a Yankees fan. Or for us, it might be the St. Louis Cardinals. But everybody, somebody who's a fan of that sports team, either somebody at work, a family member. You have people in your families and communities that are a part of that fan base. And she said that's the way it is with the Taliban. It's not that there's this kind of separate group of power and everybody else is just different and separate from that they have become a part of communities and families and everyday life. They're everywhere.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier on that, about there being lots of ethnic groups and different religions. And the predominant religion of Afghanistan is Islam.
Yes.
And but there are sects of Christians that, and it's not against the law to try to convert someone. There's a difference in the way that people view these very small sects of non-Muslims.
And even within Islam, you have different sects of Islam.
Yep.
But the Taliban are presenting and expecting people and wanting the population to follow one specific sect of Islam. Again, because they came out of the seminaries. At least that's what the leading narrative is, that they came out of seminaries from Saudi Arabia.
So this was about the Taliban. Where does Al-Qaeda fit into this?
So I think that, as I said before, like one of the challenges that we in the U.S. have is that Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, we lump them together as these Middle Eastern terrorist groups. And certainly they are, but they are distinctive and they have distinctive objectives. And as usually happens when we lump people together, we miss part of the story that makes a difference in how we interpret, how we can interact, and how we can process through. So the Taliban and Al-Qaeda have been woven together in many ways since their fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, which ended in 1989. And Al-Qaeda is much older than the Taliban. It has a broader reach. It's a global movement. Its main objective is to be against the Western world. But it is not unilaterally located in one state or one nation. So it's global and strongly against the Western world. And when the Taliban emerged, Al-Qaeda was already well established and funded. And they had resources, they had equipment. And so Al-Qaeda, as the Taliban was kind of coming up with their own objectives to, again, provide their form of security to the region of Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda provided equipment and training for the Taliban to do just that. And they, together, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban have had strained periods, but one former Taliban member described the relationship as an unbreakable bond. And Al-Qaeda members who are in Afghanistan are considered, under the Taliban rule, are considered guests of the Taliban. And so while they have their own leadership and their own structures, those who find themselves in the country under Taliban rule swear allegiance to the Taliban leader within that region and within that country. And so after 9/11, Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda at that time, was in Afghanistan as under that guest status, under the protection and with the allegiance to the Taliban. And so that's how we got, following 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan and these interactions both with Al-Qaeda and with the Taliban, and why sometimes we conflate the two. So I'm curious, Jay, what were your thoughts when you think back to the point of our invasion with Afghanistan, 9/11, 2001, and the invasion that followed? How much of this history were you aware of? Did you know? Did you understand? As you were seeing on the news that we're invading Afghanistan, 9/11 has happened, and we're moving forward with this.
I think personally for me, thinking back to September 11th, in my lifetime, now, there were other people who had been alive when there was a conflict, an invasion on American soil. But in my lifetime, that had never happened. 20 years ago, you still had World War II vets that remembered, Pearl Harbor and the outrage that came with that. And this, when you think about comparing Pearl Harbor with the Twin Towers attacks and the Pentagon and all that happened on September 11th, you can't really compare them because still Hawaii seems so far away, and I don't know, I wasn't there, but on September 11th and with 24-hour news coverage, you saw every bit of everything that happened. And the outcry was somebody has to pay for this. And so when we invaded Afghanistan, I remember thinking, do we really need to be the police of the world? We really can't take care of our own people. But so now we're in the name of democracy and then in the name of something else, we're going to go to a country and disrupt even more because they've never had peace in Afghanistan. But we're gonna go in and try to do what we think is right.
Do you think that, as you remember it, that the invasion was, I hate to use the word marketed, but that the pervasive narrative around the invasion was because of that, was because of we are going to try and bring stability and peace to the region? Or was it we are invading Afghanistan because we are going to get the people that hurt us?
I think the second. I think it was. If we're going to use the word marketed, you try to get a group of people to buy into this,
Right.
and I think that there were a lot of people that wanted someone to pay for this, someone to be responsible. So a lot of the narrative was, we are going after Osama bin Laden, and that was what, if you'd ask a lot of people, that was what the invasion was all about. Was just going in and getting bin Laden. But it turned into a 20-year war where we were sitting down there, and and a lot of people have compared it to the fall of Saigon, and there have been Vietnam vets and people have said these, you can't compare the two. But when you see a picture of someone from Afghanistan trying to hand a baby to a U.S. Army personnel on, just lifting them up to get this child out of their country. Not everything is musical theater in my world, but, it takes you back to Miss Saigon, in images that were happening within that musical that they took from what happened
From Vietnam, yeah.
in Vietnam. Yeah.
I think that we, as I've been kind of delving into the history of the region and everything that was going on over the past 2 weeks, I realized that, at the time, I didn't know the history, right? And, all of the difference between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I know I keep on coming back to that, but I think that there's part of this narrative that we just have not truly understood. And what's been going on over the past 20 years and our understanding of that has even changed and evolved. From public statements made by the federal government, even as our presence there has been maintained, the goals have shifted, the reasons for our presence there have shifted. I agree with you that when it first started, when we first invaded there on October 7th, 2001, we began combat operations there. And when that first happened, certainly the narrative was, we are going to disrupt the use, President Bush said, disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and attack the military capability of the Taliban regime with the goal of eliminating Al-Qaeda, who were the ones that hurt us. But we ended major combat operations there in 2003, and the goals shifted to what you said earlier, that idea that we are going to help to bring peace and stability to the region and to continue to root out the Taliban and to help Afghanistan build up its own military forces and security that can handle the country and that can help to keep the Taliban at bay. And over the past 20 years, we have spent, as a country, $88 billion on helping to try and train security forces and help them to build up that government. Since 2015, we've seen that continue to shift and to change in counterterrorism missions against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and affiliates in Afghanistan. And since 2015, NATO has been a larger part of that, and we've seen NATO participation. But even through our $88 billion of work, even through all the NATO work in trying to build up Afghan security forces and an Afghan national defense, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban haven't really gone anywhere. They have raged an insurgency against the Afghan government. And recently, this is particularly since the U.S., it's been more poignant since the U.S. announced that they would be withdrawing troops, have, really focused in the Afghan government that we have been training up mostly has been focused in the large metropolitan areas. And so the Taliban, Al-Qaeda have continued to kind of work in the rural areas and essentially like lying in wait, waiting out when their chance would come. We are seeing the images now that chance has come for them to work on that. One of the challenges as we're looking at the history and as we look at that history of the Taliban in the region is the fact that last February, when the Trump administration began to find a way, saying we have got to get a way to get our forces out of there, that the Trump administration began negotiating not with the Afghan government that we'd spent $88 billion working on, but with the Taliban directly, with the understanding that if they negotiated with the Taliban, then the Taliban would cease support of al-Qaeda. However, a former Taliban governor told the Washington Post that all the while that these negotiations were going on, al-Qaeda had specifically trained the Taliban leaders for these talks, and they were in consultation with al-Qaeda the whole time. And so these talks were done certainly in bad faith by the Taliban. And those talks gave the Taliban a legitimacy from the standpoint of many of the articles that I've read. Those talks directly working with the Taliban gave them a legitimacy that they had never really had. I mean, remember, even when they were the governing power from 96 to 2001, most countries in the world would not acknowledge them as legitimate and would not negotiate with the Taliban. But now the U.S. began doing that.
Whereas our policy had always been, we do not negotiate with terrorists.
Right, right.
And it makes me wonder, how much overlay is there between those three entities of the Taliban, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda? I mean, you have to assume that there are family members that are involved in any. I don't know how they look at each other.
Right.
If there's infighting among those three groups, or if it's all for a similar cause.
Well, there certainly are different, at least from the research that I've done, certainly are different long-term goals. I mean, the Taliban is specifically focused in Afghanistan, right? And they seek, at least it appears,
to be the governing
body, right? Like they were before, but this time with legitimacy, which they are getting now certainly from China and Russia, that their negotiations are working more directly. But, particularly since we announced the withdrawal of troops earlier this year and said September, when the Trump administration had worked and said that May 2021 was the goal for withdrawal. When the Biden administration came in, they said that September 11th, 2021 would be the goal for withdrawal. And since then, of course, the Taliban has basically seized control of the country. As I said, we see them lying in wait and pouncing. And we've also seen and uncovered that Afghan government and security forces that we built up, not only could they not withstand the Taliban, but that there was also corruption there, and that there were ghost soldiers there were people listed for payroll that didn't actually exist. So somebody within the government was pulling extra money. Plus, we know that some of the Afghan government officials and military were in with the Taliban. And that goes to your point about all of these different organizations being so intertwined. And so with the Taliban taking over, once again, I think it's important for us, to think about and to remember that history of the people and what they had done, that we see the world so black and white here in the United States. Like us, our goals good, Taliban bad. And anybody who can't see that or doesn't fight the Taliban is bad. But I think, too, we have to consider that the need for the people in that region to fight for survival, whatever that looks like, And so certainly the images of the planes are one of those images. But I also think about, folks who say, well, if I'm going to survive, I don't know that I want to support this dying government. I might need to flip sides in order to survive for me and my family. I see this huge challenge in that so often we look at what is right in front of us, what is often our very own limited perspective. And when we do that, I believe that we miss a huge part of the story of why things are the way that they are.
And I also think that, as we observe what's going on there, I think that there is a real fear, going back to your point, of people just accepting this new government in Afghanistan and living their lives as best they can, and the fear that this new government will convert people to be a part of something that could be destructive somewhere else, even within their own country.
Right. Well, and they've seen, while it's been under occupation over the last 20 years, they've seen women being able to be educated. They've seen what this can do in some ways that impact their everyday lives. And I wonder how that's going to play out. You know, when we talked about before that the Taliban, when in the 90s, when it was taking over the country, that it provided a sense of security, promised security and economic development and all of these things, and that people were receptive to that at that point. Some people were receptive to that, but it also came at the hands of this extremist law that today they've seen a different picture. Even though it was under occupation, it'll be interesting. I don't know if interesting is the right word, but...
And you also think back to other countries who have experienced a takeover of a government that the people didn't like. You look at the uprising several years ago in Egypt. You look at the uprising in the Czech Republic. You look at the uprising, let's go back, several hundred years. We had an uprising
Right.
against the country that we were birthed from. So,
And I think that as we're thinking about all of those different pieces, this brings us as a great segue into our "Why should we care?" portion of our talk. We've talked a lot, spent a lot of time, more time than we have the past couple of podcasts on this, and so Jay, why do you think we should care about the history?
I think that typically, there's a lot of United States citizens that we don't get into the history. We only see it, what we see on the news, what we read in the paper. If you still get a hard copy of the paper or digitally, whatever. But we see these things going on around the world, and I think that one of the things we always see this unrest in the Middle East, and most U.S. people are drawn to the news around the Palestinian conflict in Israel. We see that more, but I think because of our heritage in Christianity being drawn to that region. But so we keep up with that a little more. And I think that it's important for us to know the history around Afghanistan, too, because, you think about all the regions of unrest in that particular section of the world. It's mind-blowing. And, when you talk to people from those areas, they're the first to say, I cannot explain to you what all is going on, because this is thousands and thousands of years of conflict.
And that turmoil that people have experienced, but also like the joy of everyday life. Everyday life that happens in that region happens regardless of what's going on. So that balance of everyday life and turmoil that people experience and live with over thousands of years, and the narratives that have been formed over thousands of years that shape people's livings and lives and livelihoods and worldviews, that happens in a way that we cannot possibly understand. And often I think that, I don't know that we're encouraged to understand, because I think that humans are often limited by our own experiences and how things affect us directly. But as Christians, I believe that part of what we are called to do is to understand, or to seek to understand, and to care about, and to love people that aren't like us, right? I believe that that's at the core of the gospel.
I agree. That's one piece we haven't really talked about in this episode. We've talked about the history of Afghanistan on a very small scale, or maybe you should say, the 25,000 foot view. And it's there's always more we can learn, but also if we ever have the chance to be around the actual people who have been there and walk the walk, we're going to have a better understanding of what's going on. So
right, and I think a key there. I'm a big fan of Ted Lasso. One of the quotes from that is when he says that we are to be curious and not judgmental. And I think that so often when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to just our own understandings and lack of understandings, that we, particularly as followers of Jesus, can seek to be curious rather than judgmental, and that can, I think, get us a long way in what we're doing. So, Jay, is there anything else that, any other questions that you have or insights?
I've got lots of questions.
Not that I can answer them.
But I think we keep pushing away to have a better understanding. And I think that's kind of what the bottom line has been for this time together, is just to spark a curiosity. But, now it's up to us to do some digging and not just rely on what we hear on television or read.
Yeah. Curiosity and empathy, I think, is a big one. Conversation for another time. But I think that one of the big things that we're going to see coming out of this is a whole new refugee crisis, as we can see with people trying to get out of the country. So something that we can seek to have empathy for and to engage with.
A lot of people have asked how they can help the people of Afghanistan, and I know that the United Methodist Global Ministries has had a close relationship as a partner in Afghanistan since 1966. And so they address community health and community development needs. So there's an advance number, and United Methodists are familiar with advance numbers, but that's how you can give. You can look up Global Ministries, United Methodist Church, and then you can find the information that way. Also, the United Methodist Committee on Relief also has a presence and is responding to the immediate humanitarian needs of the people of Afghanistan. And that's they're going through UMCOR, International Disaster Response, and that can also be found online. And Church World Service, which is a Methodist partner organization, is working on the resettlement of Afghan families in the United States. And to find out more, you can go to cwsglobal.org, and you'll find Church World Service there. And finally, there's an urgent need for advocacy to protect all Afghan citizens who are fleeing violence or who fear persecution. And you can also find more information about that at Church World Service, because they offer helpful guidance on how to move forward in that area.
So our history quote this month falls a little bit along the lines of some of what we have been talking about today. It is from Maya Angelou, who says that history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So I thought that was appropriate as we think about what we've been talking about today.
And what are we talking about next month, Kathleen?
So next month, we are going to do an in-depth profile of Saint Augustine or Augustine, depending on where you're from and how you pronounce it. We're going to look at Saint Augustine and dating problems. So how we got to where we are with a Christian understanding of sexual morality. Should be interesting.
Another spicy take.
So we would love to hear from you as far as things that you would like for us to talk about, questions that you have, comments, all of the above. And you can email us at podcast@phumc.com. You can follow Pulaski Heights on Facebook at Pulaski Heights UMC, or we are on Instagram at @PHUMC Hillcrest.
Faith stories, saints, sinners, and spicy takes is brought to you by Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church in Little Rock, Arkansas. Our engineers are Patrick Shones and Jacob Nolan. Our producer is Michael McMurray. I'm Reverend Jay Clark.
I'm Reverend Kathleen McMurray. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you will join us again next month. Share this podcast and tell someone about Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church.